Hello, everyone. Thank you for checking out this special episode of Really Dicey. This is Manny, and I am here with.
Hi, I'm James Mendez Hodes. What's good? Thank you so much for having me on, Manny.
Yes, I wanted to reach out to you because of your work with the Cities of Faith and Wonder, one of the newest
hmm
books that have come out with the 7th role playing game from
hmm
Chaosium, particularly your sections about Iskandar.
Oh
Now,
yeah.
personally for myself, I grew up watching the old like Sinbad
Oh
movies from the
yeah.
70s and at the library when I was in, I used to love reading the 1001 Nights stories. And I think for a while I delved into Al Qadim and D&D back then because I just loved the
Oh, I remember
stories.
that.
And but that Al Qadim is like 30 years old now, over 30 years
It
old.
is. It is. Yeah. And
Yeah, and much about culture, much of our understanding about history has developed since then.
mhm.
And so I've been looking for something similar that's more something similar to the culture and the region and mythology that's up to date and more modern and so one of my issues with academia is like I feel like it only captures like one group of people of the Middle East, one
Mhm.
culture, and none of it is huge. There's so many different cultures, so much mythology, so many different stories out there. So I was excited that 7C put out this book because now we have something that we can look at and use as game masters. So I'm
Yeah.
sorry, I don't mean to give it the whole monologue. My first question to you is like, how did you get involved in this project?
Oh, sure. So yeah, I'll give you my backstory. So I started out writing for Seventh Sea in 2016. That was 2 years after my very first professional game writing job, which was on an expansion to the Urban Shadows RPG from Magpie Games and that was in late 2014. I kept working on RPGs, and then I started at Seventh Sea full time in the beginning of 2016. And the first book that I worked on for Seventh Sea was Pirate Nations, and uh, that was a great experience, and we won the a silver Ennie for that book, and that was sort of the beginning of my full time RPG career. So I kept working for Seventh Sea full time with other little freelance things here and there up until the company folded. And then the Seventh Sea IP was no longer attached to John Wick Presents because there wasn't a John Wick Presents, and it eventually ended up at Chaosium. And in the and then all the people who had been working for John Wick Presents lost their jobs, and we went off and did other things. So um, after that, I was still full time freelancing, and I still do that today. So at that time, my work was mostly writing and design. But in the intervening years, since the collapse of John Wick Presents, I've shifted more to cultural consulting as a bigger part of my work. So now I'm about 80/20 cultural consulting and game design. And cultural consulting, in case anyone's not familiar with it, is a cultural consultant helps other creatives represent diverse and marginalized identities in uplifting and affirming ways, which is a fancy way of saying that I tell people they're racist for a living. Um, but it's I enjoy it a great deal. Telling people they're racist is only a small part of the job, and a lot more of what I end up doing as a cultural consultant is more similar to what I did on Seventh Sea, which was cultural design and bringing in cultural elements which people from underrepresented communities wouldn't just not be offended by, but would actually feel excited about.
Hmm.
So,
And that's great because personally, I feel that if I'm playing something out of my circle of understanding, I grew up in New York City, so when it
mhm,
comes to like city environments,
Yeah.
in 20th century America. Okay, I got that down pat. I know what I'm talking about. I know what I'm running.
Hmm.
But sometimes when, it could be places in Africa, Russia, or Europe, even Europe
Hmm.
per se,
Hmm.
I personally, if I'm going to run a setting there, I want to have a good understanding of what it's like. So I give my players the most authentic experience possible. Um,
Definitely.
you know, so
Yeah.
so, so if I may ask, when it came to now again, when it comes to Middle Eastern culture or cities, predominantly in role playing games, there's not a lot, and what is out
Hmm.
there, I want to say they were perfect. So what were your
Yeah.
challenges then in making this chapter?
So, so I think that Iskandar is based directly and heavily on the city we now call Istanbul, which has at different times in history been called, Constantinia or uh uh I think one of the first names for the city was Lygos in an old Greek source. But yeah, since then it's been known as Byzantium, Constantinople, various different names, and now Istanbul. Um so when I started researching this city, there's so much history, and there are so many different periods in the history of the city in the real world, that move in so many different directions, that I feel like you could write an entire game of the scale and scope of 7th Sea and just set it in this one city. Um, so so choosing individual elements to focus on, and also choosing elements which represented a range of historical periods and like many different historical elements of Istanbul, which would in particular resonate with people who have lived in Istanbul recently, as well as with people who don't know the city, um, was was challenging just in its scope. So one of the most important things for me as a developer was making sure that I had a recent perspective on Istanbul to bring into the chapter. And Hakan Sayaloglu wrote a great deal of the text that ended up in this book. I don't think he was credited in the final version of the PDF, and I'm not sure why that is, but I do have to shout out his work as bringing an invaluable perspective of what Istanbul means to Turkish people today and what that city has been like in more recent history, because he grew up there and spent a great deal of time there and had all kinds of things to say about street cats. Especially there was a lot of stuff about street cats in Istanbul which we brought into the book, as an important touchstone that would have been present in history, and which especially would read as distinctly Istanbul today.
Hmm.
We also had a couple of other authors on that chapter who I don't think were ended up being credited. Neil Raymond Price worked on some of this content, whom I originally met way back in Exalted fandom, and then worked closely with on Scion. And then Janaea Kemper, a dear friend of mine who I just saw the other week for the first time in a long time, who also contributed a great deal, and who has worked together with me on various different 7th Sea projects.
So one thing I noticed about reading the chapter of Iskandar is that
Mhm.
it's heavy. This is not I it's heavy in the sense that there's so much great information in this
Mhm.
chapter. It's something you have to game masters will have to pay attention to what's there because there's so much like nuggets of information, history and mythology, and that's something I wanted to ask you about when it comes to
Mhm.
putting together a chapter that's based on history and based on mythology. How do you balance mythology and history in a chapter? How does that come together?
That's a really great question. So, uh, 7th Sea is a secondary world. It's heavily and strongly inspired by our real world, but it isn't our real world, and it shouldn't be exactly the same. We want to have space for people to make this world their own and to give their own spin to things. But I think that there are ways to do that which use history and mythology in evocative and inspirational ways, and also which contribute to the consistency and the vividness of the world. Yeah, technically this is world building, but world building kind of isn't the way that I think of it in my head. In my head, it feels like taking the Legos that are in a box and looking at the original instructions and looking at what else I can build with those same pieces, that doesn't end up being like the same Lego castle or the same Lego spaceship, but which still has recognizable elements from that original version, which are still fun to play with. And a lot of the time, those creative acts are less like adding new things or changing things than they are finding elements that were in original history or were in original mythology, which weren't a huge part of the grand scope of Ottoman history in this case, and turning up the dials of those. So we use fantasy fiction based on the real world as an opportunity to zero in on parts of real world mythology that excite us the most. And especially the parts of real world mythology and history that tend not to show up in really common versions of Turkey, really common versions of the Middle East that you had commonly and historically seen in uh, traditional fantasy settings.
So let me ask, now that this book is out, what were some of your favorite stories or things that you wanted to share with readers? Was there anything that you were happy to see in this book?
Yeah, let me see. I'm opening it and flipping through it right now. So some of my favorite little details are some of the characters who ended up in kind of complicated or morally gray places. Um, and this is something that technically we weren't actually supposed to do. Seventh Sea had a very strong rule for all of the heroes and the villains and the NPCs especially, and the background characters that we created, that this is a world that you would recognize from like those old Sinbad movies, from like Douglas Fairbanks, Errol Flynn, um, from a lot of Saturday morning cartoons, honestly, where heroes are heroes, villains are villains, and it's possible for heroes to fall or villains to be redeemed, but there aren't supposed to be moral grays and grimdark anti-heroes, and there isn't really supposed to be a great deal of moral complexity. Moral choices, yes. Moral complexity, not as much. um the problem with this assignment is that humans are really complicated and ethical choices are really hard. So the more you fill out and flesh out like a sapient being's characterization, the the more the more complex and the more morally gray they start to look. And especially when you have nations in conflict with one another, and we have to have conflict. Um, and those conflicts had to have various different good and bad choices for players to make. The things that you started out to create as morally black and white stop looking that way the closer that you look at them. And now that I'm off of 7C, now that we're not working on it again, I think some of those places where people got complicated are are actually my favorite characters, my favorite parts of this book. So just looking at the characters, we've got um we've got Ben Gurion, the Silent Song, who is the spiritual leader of Al-Din, the analog of Islam in Seventh Sea. And this guy's running a surveillance state. He lives in a tower, and he is the most hardcore defender of Al-Din in the city, and he is a great inspiration, and his voice means a lot um to everyone in the city who worships Al Musawir. but he also does some stuff that would probably make you uncomfortable. Like he has a huge network of spies and surveyors and intelligencers who are spread throughout the city. And no matter who you are or where you are, this guy might be watching you. And this guy might be making some grand decision about the city's religious fate and your religious fate based on the fact that he saw you do something and you didn't know that he saw you do. And I think he represents in many ways the complicated relationship that many people have with the idea of God or the idea of God judging them. Um, and again, that goes back to that theme of like there's supposed to be these moral black and whites. Like God is supposed to be good. God is supposed to be the source of everything that's good. But also it's a little weird that he's watching you all the time. That's the kind of complexity that I end up really appreciating in this book. And that was one of let me see. Yeah, that was one of Hakan's characters. Um and then we also have characters like there's a bunch of like there's some straight up villains like Jang Janzada, the ringleader of the Bivar Asp, who are a terrorist organization and revolutionary organization connected to some stuff in the Crescent Empire book. Um, and he's honestly like he's really fun. He started out as a transit commissioner and then clawed his way up into oh no, he just is the transit commissioner. He's still in that position, but he uses that position to further the goals of like an extremist revolutionary organization which is based in Persis. And that's you find out more about that in the Crescent Empire book. But in short, Persis has many different revolutionary organizations which have different levels of like we want to work within the system to we want to tear down the system to we want to burn everything down and replace it with evil serpent monsters. Um, and this guy's on the serpent monster end of things. Um,
Hmm.
so yeah, he's a more clear cut villainous figure, and who might be inspired by like a. I was about to say Cardinal Richelieu from the Three Musketeers, who we talk about a lot in inspirations for Seventh Sea, but again, Cardinal Richelieu, he's not actually that clear cut a figure. He's actually kind of morally gray. So
Hmm.
yeah, so those kinds of elements are those are the parts that are most evocative for me, at least character wise.
Hmm. So what's interesting also about Iskandar, and I think maybe the Avalon, I believe, is
Mhm.
the version of Great Britain and Seventh
Yeah.
Sea, where there's certain I could say magical elements are
Hmm.
part of it. For example, the jinn are a part of
Hmm.
Iskandar. If I may ask, how are the jinn portrayed in Iskandar exactly?
This is a part that I think Jonea Kemper had a huge influence on how the Jinn ended up being portrayed. But the so the portrayal of Jinn in this city um evokes some of the way that we know a lot about Jinn coming through uh, Islamic mythology. So there are various creatures and beings from pre-Islamic mythology. Um, Jinn are explicitly pre-Islamic, and there are stories and tales about Jinn which predate the rise and expansion of Islam. Although um Islam definitely took the idea of jinn and then spread it further. So you're going to have stories about jinn. I read an epic from the Songhai Empire, which prominently featured a jinn, and that's in sub-Saharan like Western Africa. That was in the epic of Askia Muhammad, the first leader of the Songhai Empire. And yeah, that dude's dad, I think, is a Jin. Um so uh one of the important elements of Jain and Islamic mythology specifically is that they always end up in a subordinate position to the faithful. Um, they don't they're like people. They can make good or bad choices, and there are good or evil jinn. Um, but whenever a jinn tries to rise up against God, they're always pushed down. And it's always the faithful who do that, making sure they defend others from these beings who are often very powerful and very predatory. Um, so at the same time, though, one of my favorite topics in any kind of fantasy game is the personhood of monsters. So uh, I think I think of this as like my genesis as a game designer or as a cultural consultant, but I guess technically it actually happened after all of this stuff with Seventh Sea was over. My favorite topic in all of fantasy is orcs. I really, really like orcs, and I was always really frustrated that D&D depicted orcs as these inhuman, savage, stupid, violent monsters because at first I didn't really understand it. It just kind of made me vaguely uncomfortable, and I had sympathy for orcs for reasons I didn't understand. And then later on, when I started actually doing research into it and realizing, oh, okay, orcs were actually explicitly Tolkien created orcs as an intentional Asian stereotype. And some of these feelings I've been having about orcs come from the fact that people talk about orcs the way that people have historically talked about Asian people, and that's why I feel so much sympathy for them. That that was huge for me, and that's something that I think about every game that I work on these days. And you can see a little bit of that attitude in the Jinn in Seventh Sea. Um, so Seventh Sea is a game where you mostly play as humans, but it's a world that's populated by lots of non-human sapient beings, and those non-human sapient beings also have moral agency and moral choices. So, so the Jinn in Iskandar are actually in a pretty bad position because Al Musawir struck them down and damned them, and uh, placed them in a subservient position to the faithful, um, which makes sense if you think about Jinn running rampant and oppressing humans using the fact that they have greater magical power, but the Jinn can't do that anymore. They they don't have magic. They're immortal. They barely even have individual identity, and they've been cast down into this subordinate position. And I hope that when people see that, they feel they feel empathy or sympathy for the Jinn, and they think like, all right, yeah, this happened to someone else, and in this case it benefited humans, but it could have been the other way around.
Let's talk about some of the city regions in
Mhm.
Iskandar. Were there any of them that really that you were happy to put into the book? Anything that any of them that you look back now stand out to you?
Yes, let's talk about sports. I want to talk about sports. Um, so I don't watch a lot of sports. I watch a medium I don't know. I watch a medium amount of sports. I watch every single sumo wrestling tournament without fail. I always watch the top division highlights, even if I don't have time for the lower divisions. So yeah, I love watching sumo wrestling, but all these American sports that I grew up with, it's hard for me to sit through a whole baseball game. And I have in my whole life, I worked as a gym teacher. My first job out of college, I was a gym teacher, and I got out there and I looked at a 12-year-old kid, and I was like, you need to explain to me the rules of football because I don't know what we're doing here. Um, and this like and he was like, what, really? And I was like, yeah, I did like wrestling and cross country in school. I don't understand downs and grids and like why you're only allowed to throw sideways. I don't what So sports is not a big part of my real world life, but I love writing about sports in role playing games. It's one of my favorite topics. So I made sure that every chance that I get to write about organized sports throughout the world of Seventh Sea, that I put that in there. And especially anytime that I got the opportunity to mention organized sports crossing cultural and national boundaries, um that I always jumped on that because yeah, like some of my first memories of gaming as a child are like Street Fighter and having all these characters from all these different countries who are racial stereotypes, but we'll set that to side for the moment, meeting and interacting with each other in a competitive context. And I love the internationality of that, even if it's complex and racist in retrospect, like many of these other things we talked about enjoying as kids. So yeah, I love writing about organized sports. And in Iskandar, uh yeah, there's a lot going on, but the most popular sport here is chogan, which is the settings term for polo. I mean, it's also a real term for polo from Iran, but yeah, chogan is the most common name for the game of polo. And what I think is interesting about polo in the context of this city is that most of the people in this city are really poor, like most of the people in many cities. Um, so polo's not something that you can just play in the street, right? If there's wrestling competitions, if there's other popular games, kids can play that in the street. People can play that after work with their friends. And polo isn't like that. It's descended from military training exercises. So in order to play polo, you need immense resources. And most of the people who played polo in or chogan in this setting historically came from noble lineages where they grew up with horses, they grew up being able to hire coaches, and they grew up being able to offload responsibilities to their servants and spend all this time hitting a ball from a horse in competition with other similarly privileged people. And um, this is also a quality that you see in in real world sports that's really interesting. They appeal to every walk of life, and they're accessible through stuff like mass media, especially today, to even the poorest people in the world. But many of the people that you're watching are the product of these elite systems of power, which give these people resources to do things that they otherwise wouldn't be able to do. So Chogan in Istanbul represents the class stratification and the class conflict, which is one of the city's defining factors, and which even some of the best people in the city, like the Empress, who's supposed to be explicitly a hero, um, yeah, she's explicitly a hero, but she's still the emperor of an empire which got a lot of its power and territory via colonialism. Um, so yeah, all of these things are Chogan is a microcosm of all that stuff that's going on. Um, and um, but a lot of the people who are watching it don't even think about that. Or they kind of push it into the back of their heads because mostly they're engaged with the individual rivalries between the different teams and all the drama that we know from both real world sports and our favorite like sports anime or whatever. Um, so yeah, I loved all the stuff about the Zircana, about the different sports that are played here, and the on page where is it? 108. There's a box about local derbies between different teams who hate each other, and this is half a page, and it's like my favorite half page in the whole book. I forget whether I wrote this or Jonea wrote this or it was both of us, but I tried to seed a whole bunch of conflict and a whole bunch of complexity and a whole bunch of uh like backhanded, underhanded, bad behavior pro wrestling style through all the descriptions of these teams and the way that they're interacting. So there's like people cheating, there's people like hitting each other's horses on the sly and the referee didn't see it, or maybe the referee was paid off not to care. And then there's this one team where the rival players, they're actually falling in love even as they're fighting against each other. And yeah, so this is my favorite half page in the whole book.
If I may ask, so I
Yeah.
think most people, and I'm going to say most people in America, I
Yeah.
think when they think of like a city in a Middle East, they kind of think first
Hmm.
toward like Aladdin. I think maybe Aladdin may be one of the
Hmm.
few movies that actually showcase what cities look like, or a city looks like
Hmm.
in the Middle East. How for anyone that's interested in looking more into it, comparing it to Iskandar, how would you compare Iskandar to maybe what's been portrayed in American media?
Yeah, sure. So to understand a work like Aladdin, and um, to understand the way that West Asia and North Africa been portrayed in American media, um, the the crucial concept is this thing called Orientalism. And for anyone who might not be familiar with it, a scholar named Edward Said coined the term Orientalism, um, in a book that focused. It started out focusing mostly on art history, and it started out focusing on why are all there these why are there all of these European paintings and art forms and works depicting the Middle East, or depicting a version of the Middle East that Middle Eastern people can't really recognize. It's just this like amalgam of kind of vaguely Middle Eastern people and things and exaggerated versions of all of these like little things about all these various different countries that have been digested and amalgamated into um, a version of quote unquote the Orient, which historically referred to the area we now call like West Asia or the Middle East, which in modern parlance mostly refers to East Asia. But Said himself was, I think, Palestinian, and he was originally talking about the Middle East, although we absolutely can and should apply these same ideas to other parts of Asia and their depiction in the West. But the Orientalist vision of the Middle East is a digested amalgam of all of Europeans' favorite things to look at about the Middle East, which define all of that region as an other in a way that reinforces European visions of who they themselves are. Um, and sometimes Orientalism comes from a place of just like, this stuff seems cool, I'd like to play with it and then walk away from it afterwards. And something like Al-Qadim is a great example of that, and something like Aladdin is a great example of that. But um art also has effects. Art also affects culture and perception, and if the only vision you ever get of brown people comes from Aladdin, ugh, that's going to be rough. But Aladdin is only one of the latest examples of a long history of Orientalist film and media. And we were talking earlier about stuff like the Sinbad stories and their interpretations in America. And if you want to, probably the best way to like see what Orientalism looks like in 20th century America is to watch the Thief of Baghdad movies. Um,
Baghdad.
yeah, so there are these old movies. There were two of them. I think there was a silent version, and then there was a remake of that. Um, and these are these great like influential legends of American Orientalist film about. There are these wild adventure stories with magic and princesses and carpets and harems and seraglios and all of these things, which were Americans' favorite things to think about in the Middle East, depicting like it's all frozen in a specific period of fantasy time, um, which is like Americans' favorite or Westerners' favorite parts of the Middle East to think about when they think about fiction, because that's another element of Orientalism, the idea that countries outside the Eurocentric mainstream are kind of frozen in time and they don't really advance or progress except through contact with advanced and enlightened post-Renaissance European societies. Um, so yeah, Thief of Baghdad was a huge influence on Aladdin. And many of the things that are still a headache for brown people today have their roots in or have connections to these kinds of Orientalist media. Um, so yeah, Orientalism, Thief of Baghdad, interpretations of stuff like the Sinbad stories that we saw as kids. All of these things were huge influences on the kinds of like pulp and heroic action that directly inspired Seventh Sea. So what we're trying to do, especially in the Crescent Empire book and in Iskandar, are to take those Orientalist ideas and to take a kind of Orientalist premise, making a game about the Middle East in English based in America, and recenter the depictions of those people on the way that Asians talk about ourselves. So there's the lies that other people tell about us, right? And that's where we get things like Orientalism and racism and offensive stereotypes. But then there's also the lies that we tell about ourselves. And those are the mythologies that we grow up with, the folklore we tell our children in order to tell them about our values. And when we're talking about fantasy fiction, I always like to focus on the lies we tell about ourselves, because those are fun and those are important. And even if they're not true, they're still meaningful. Um, so so that's how I want people to think about the cities that we make up in places like this one. Because this was about how Hakan wanted people to see the city where he had grown up. This is about how I want people to see Asian identity the way that I describe it for myself. Um, yeah, that's the defining element of like moving away from those Orientalist portrayals and uh, looking at things in a new way that's still not history, really. It's not the real world, but it still means something about the real world and it means something to the real people who live in the analogs of these places.
Hmm. Well, let me ask you a sort of the similar question, but almost at the opposite end.
Sure.
So, 17, I think has done a great job with not only with cities of faith and wonder, but also with the Crescent
Mhm.
Empire. I thought they did a real good job in trying to, I don't know if we correct, but reintroduce in a sense of
Mhm.
like Middle Eastern mythology back into
Yeah,
RPGs. Um,
definitely.
if for anyone that may even though they read the books, they still need maybe something extra media wise to help give them
Oh
a
yeah.
bigger picture. Would you recommend like any books, movies, music, anything to help them?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. So looking at the Crescent Empire book, so this is probably the book that I'm most proud of. I think that of all the books that came out in the Seventh Sea line, I was really proud of Pirate Nations. I was really proud of the, winning my first Emmy for that. But I think Crescent Empire was the best book we ever did. Um, and so if you look at Crescent Empire, it starts with this poem called "The Palace Insects," which is the longest poem that I've ever written. And it's a ripoff. It is a ripoff of a poem called "The Conference of the Birds" by Farida Din Attar, um, which is it's a poem about a bunch of birds which go on an adventure to find the bird king. And the story that's in the Conference of the Birds is hugely influential in our vision of Seventh Sea. It's a beautiful poem. There's stuff in it that's like appropriate for kids, and also evocative for adults. It has concepts which are relevant to Sufism, to other forms of Islam, and to Zoroastrianism, even all kinds of different all kinds of different Middle Eastern mythologies, and it's a beautiful poem, and you can find it on the internet for free if you hunt around. Um, and so if you want to learn more about like the poetic traditions that are represented in Crescent Empire and in Cities of Faith, definitely check out that poem. Check out other poetry from the Middle East, like ghazals and qasida and everything. Gets it. See if you can find a Rumi translation or a Hafiz translation that isn't by Coleman Barks. See if you can find something actually translated by Middle Eastern people. You'll probably have a better experience. So yeah, poetry is like where this book starts, and yeah, definitely check some of that stuff out. Um, Other things that I can recommend, if you want something on the other end of things, this is a book that I just wrote. This is a book I just read recently, and it's very different in tone. It's called Escape from Baghdad. It's by Saad Z. Hossein, and it's his debut novel. He writes in a lot of different genres. He does a lot of like science fiction. But his first book is it is a pulp adventure story that you might recognize from. It sounds kind of like a Game of Fiasco or a Coen Brothers movie. It's about these two con men in occupied Baghdad in the aughts, like right after America invaded Iraq, and they're in occupied Baghdad. Everybody's fighting over everything, and they try to sneak their way out of the region they're stuck in with this captured prisoner who used to work for Saddam Hussein, and they're trying to find this treasure that's in another part of Baghdad, which is or another part of Iraq that's like almost impossible to get to because it's crawling with Americans and it's crawling with Islamist extremists and crawling with like different factions of Islamist extremists who hate the other factions. Um, and it starts out as this just like pulp adventure stories about some bad people trying to get some money. And then the story slowly expands. And then it goes from like, yeah, just funny stuff about like bad guys into this. Uh, I'm not going to spoil too much about it, but it turns into a gigantic, like, world spanning ancient conspiracy that goes back hundreds or thousands of years. Yeah, hundreds and hundreds of years. Um, and I think when you get to that part, you'll recognize a lot of the things that you might have liked about the Seventh Sea backstory, and the kinds of like conspiracies and like the dueling secret societies. If you're into that angle on Seventh Sea, like, and you like pulp action, definitely check out Escape from Baghdad. Content warning though, it's violent as hell. People are being terrible to each other and Islamophobic and racist. But it's very funny and very exciting.
Oh, excellent, excellent. So before we wrap up,
Yeah.
is there anything about Iskandar that you wanted to share that I haven't asked you about?
Some of my, I guess, my last, one of the last favorite things about this book, um, is the way that it connected to other Seventh Sea books. And I think this is both a strength and weakness of Seventh Sea. Um, that the books connect together, and if you look at little details in one book, you'll find you'll find little arrows pointing you to things in other books that connect to those. So even stuff like looking at some other sports, right? There's in addition to Chogan, there's some stuff about Turkish oil wrestling, which is one of the oldest in the real world. It's the oldest sporting competition that exists. And yeah, these jack dudes cover each other in oil and then they wrestle, and the object is to reach your hand all the way through the other guy's pants. So you can imagine why people like to watch this. And yeah, I watch it for the technique. Yeah. Um, so so even in just in that section, there are references among the wrestlers to people from different regions. So there are, I think, Khazari competitors. There are competitors from like other countries like Numa and Usura. And even connections to there's one main character who's Ifrian, who's the favorite to win the belt. So there's all these little connections to other Seventh Sea books, usually from like before the Chaosium period. There were um, a lot of the names and things changed when Seventh Sea moved to Chaosium. So there's lots of references to like regions and proper nouns in this book, which don't actually exist in Seventh Sea because they were part of kind of a different vision of what the world looked like. So yeah, I hope that for those people who are like diligently following like every single book that we worked on, I hope that they can see. I hope that they, when they see those little details to like, oh, this thing from the Nawakan Alliance, they're like, oh, cool, yeah, I read that book. That feels like it's for me. So yeah, those would I recommend that every game mythology do this? Not necessarily. I always found it kind of frustrating, like trying to remember everything in one World of Darkness book that referenced every other World of Darkness book. But if you are that deep into the mythology and you are that invested in it, I hope you enjoy those little details.
Mm. And I'm so happy that we're living in a time where newer role-playing books are not just giving us, new options, new story ideas, everything, but we're learning something from them as well. And
Yeah.
I think that's wonderful.
Thank you.
So viewers, thank you for watching our segment. James, thank you for taking the time to talk to us about your works.
Yeah, you're
And
welcome.
I guess be safe,
Yeah.
everyone. Take care.
Yeah. Peace.